Doing any sort of compliance assessment on any sort of hosting provider is normally not the simple task. Indeed, it can be very difficult paperwork laden process, but when we start talking about how that's done on cloud providers, it starts to become quite complex. Certainly something I went through many times in the corporate environment, and it was never simple. There are always a lot of to and for and ultimately and lot of compromises. Well, and in this lecture I want to talk about some of the things that you need to consider when it comes to assessing cloud providers. Let's start with some things information that can be a bit difficult to get from them. So for example, something is simple as a physical address. I have seen cases where the organization involved would expect that a hosting provider would simply give them the address of where the data center is located. Yet as this organization started to transform into the cloud, I saw reluctance from the cloud providers to provide that information because often it is a part of their security postures not to disclose the physical location. Now this might be something which we could refer to as security tips. So let's just tell them where the data center is, and that might reduce the risk of assigning it. But be that as it may, this is the way of some cloud providers choose to operate, and this is a piece of information that can be difficult to obtain. Certain internal procedures can also be difficult to gather from the cloud provider, and they often don't want to disclose the information for a variety of reasons. Sometimes there is a competitive advantage in their particular processes. Other times they feel that they put some of their defenses at their risk. If they are able to discover how this procedure work, in fact, that's often the time for not wanting to disclose certain security defenses. For example, it's very difficult to understand precisely what sort of distributed denial of service defenses are cloud providers, and it does make sense because where that information to become public, that could be used by an adversary to try and circumvent those controls. Certainly that is the rationale of the cloud providers that don't like to provide this piece of information. Now for organization doing compliance assessments, this becomes a difficult task because you now need to meet some model. They need to gather enough information to be confident in their choice of cloud provider, yet also not exceed the level of information that the cloud provides and cloud providers themselves are willing to provide. However, cloud provides a usual and happy to provide quite a bit of information about other aspects of their security profile. So let me show you what I mean. Just as cloud providers try to get a economic as a scale from having a large rollout of infrastructure, they also often to try to kill many birds with one stone by demonstrating the compliance standard and they meet. So for example, in Microsoft case, in their trust center they talk about the number of different standards. So for example, you will see that many of these are regional standard or standard implemented by an individual country, but these other have a very well recognized international standard of requirements. So things like this and PCI, and in fact we have a look at the PCI. So here is the PCI. So we can see that the US compliant with the PCI DSS version 3.1, of which of course governments the way payment cards need to be stored, processed and transmitted on drilling down into the PCI page. We can see quite a bit of information about the compliance and level of achieved, but also it also includes a bit of information here about the actual service for which they have achieved in PCI comp. Now this might looks like quite a bit comprehensive set of services, and it is, but it's also not everything. Just putting your things in Microsoft as you are a cloud does not make them a piece. I complain not only other certain services, but that has an achieved that compliances, but of course you can still make an application non-compliant even when it's placed inside a PCI DSS compliant environment, so you can still mess up the compliances. But the point is that even though you may not be able to get all the same answer around compliance assessment from a cloud provider, you are very frequently find quite a robust set of other standards that they have reached, and they are usually very happy to make those documents public too. So let me show you one more thing before we wrap up. And this is the history from down here in Australia in 2011, and this is the history. So it's related to the Aussie hosting providing that was previously known as Distribute IT. So they suffered a really serious attack, which, as the story says here in this article, effectively left the company servers uncoverable, and they lost all their client sites, all the data, all of their backups just gone forever. This clearly had a major impact on Distribute IT. They had to shut down, but it also had a massive impact on those who had chosen to use this cloud provider. This is precise to the reason why organizations want to do the compliance assessment. They want to establish with some degree of confidence that the provider they are putting their data in, so it isn't going to suffer faith at the same as Distribute IT. Now we can never be 100% certain about this. There is no absolute position of security. However, this has become almost the canonical reference for why a process assessment and verification of which cloud data should go into is important. So the compliance assessment, and because of that it starts talking about penetration testing. So let's talk about the shadow ID. So if you don't recognize shadow ID by name, you have probably recognized the symptoms of it. Someone in the accounting department who has an Access database that manages all their books for a certain part of the business. IT had nothing to do with it, but somebody knew a little bit about how to whip up an Access database, and now the organization is become really dependent on it. But it hasn't gone through any of the normal organizational approval processes, so it doesn't have the coding standard or the security patterns or any of the things that are important to building robust and sustainable software. So shadow IT is not a new risk. It's not a new risk specific to the cloud. It's one of that we have had for decades now. But what changes with the cloud is just how easy it is for anyone to turn around and stand up services that run for an organization, but totally circumvent all of those. So, and all of those circumvent that IT controls. So let me give you an example. So this is the digital ocean, and they become really popular in recent times for being very cost effective and very fast. You can get an SSD cloud server up and running in within like even a less than a minute, like 55 seconds. Now that's very interesting and exempling that cloud characteristics of on-demand self-service. That is what we want out of the cloud, but of course by making it so easily accessible and so fast to spin up, just about anyone can do that. So from the shadow IT perspective, the risk we have now is corners of the organization installing up their own cloud implementation, often without any engagement whatsoever with IT, and totally skirting around the organization controls that should clear the way things work. Like the cloud is actually stored up. The very thing that makes the cloud so attractive is the same thing that increasing the risk of shadow IT. Let's go and talk about some of the ways that we can manage this better. Here's a few things to think about when it comes to reducing the risk of shadow IT. So first of all, actually understanding which cloud resources already is in the organization. You may find that you already have shadow IT. Go and find out where those pockets of cloud actually exist. So now of course you also want to know who is actually creating them. Remember, the cloud service were not necessarily virtual machine running somewhere in an IaaS sort of model. This could be a SaaS implementation, for example. If someone using SurveyMonkey, perfect example of software as a service, and has actually passed through their appropriate organization protocols, and those protocols controls is just not who's creating these services but who's then using them. So how much of an organization now has a dependency on this service? The difference between a few people in one department and hundreds of people across the organization, which is going to determine how to trying unify these little pockets of clouds into a more cohesive organization strategy. Now you may well find that there are the pockets of organization where cloud exists and it does actually adhere the compliances and security policies, but equally the ease of standing up these services means you will be able to find corners of the organization where their shadow IT cloud that doesn't adhere. I have seen many cases of shadow IT in the corporate world over many years, and one of those things that always struck me that usually solving an actual business problem. So most of the time shadow IT doesn't pop up without a good reason, and what you are usually find is that there is some discrete business problem. The problem standing up these services are trying to solve. So what I would encourage you to try and do is, when you see shadow IT is pop up in this fashion, to think about what the underlying problem is. Why say shadow IT is here? Why couldn't they get the service through the formal IT channel of the organization? So in a case like cloud, if someone is going out and getting a virtual server from DigitalOcean, like I saw previously, it only takes 55 seconds. And what can the organization better do to make those machines so more readily accessible within the construct of a formal cloud strategy? Clearly the technology exists. DigitalOcean can do it in 55 seconds. How can you help the person that really genuinely needs a server and quickly get that machine without skirting around and the organization control? So that's the shadow IT, and indeed that is the organizational security consideration lectures.